All right, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to Keys to the Kingdom. I'm Marissa, and I hope everybody's having a good Shabbat today. I hope you're having a nice weekend. And if you celebrate Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah. I hope you're having a nice Hanukkah. Hello, Mirsada. I'm so glad you could make it, sweetie. Glad that you're here. I'm just going to let a few people come on before we get started. I do want to let everybody know, in case you didn't know, once again, I will be doing a book giveaway. I only have one, but we are reading from this book today, The Real Story of Hanukkah. So this book right here is the book that we're going to be reading from, and I have one to give away. So what I'll ask you to do is put your names in the comments stating that you're interested in your name going in for the drawing. I will probably do a drawing tomorrow or Monday for this book, hopefully tomorrow. But I will be giving one of these away. So make sure that you drop your name in the comments and let me know. Maybe drop a I am interested, maybe with your hand raised up. Let me know, and I'll put your name down for the book giveaway. Miranda says, this is my first year celebrating Hanukkah. Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. That is very exciting. I'm glad that that we're going to be having a few people here today that are celebrating Hanukkah for the first time, because it is important. And Mersada, I will definitely put your name down. In fact, let me do that now before I forget. I should just start writing everybody's names down. For the book giveaway, let me write your name down, sweetie. Anybody else interested in the book that we're giving away today, that we're going to be reading from, let me know in the comments, and then I'll be drawing names probably tomorrow, and then I'll be mailing it out to whoever wins. But what I was saying was, I'm glad that we're going to be having, several people here today that are celebrating Hanukkah for the first time, because I think it's important to know why we celebrate certain things. Why do we even acknowledge Hanukkah? Because most people hear Hanukkah and they think it's Jewish, and that means you don't believe in the Messiah, you're not recognizing the Messiah. There's always been this separation of Christmas and Hanukkah being completely different. Christian means you believe in Jesus. Christmas means you believe in Jesus, and Hanukkah means that you don't. And it's unfortunate because there's been this wall between the two. So people really even haven't gotten a chance to explore what the story of Hanukkah was ever even about. And if they did, it was probably, most people when they the things that they do know about Hanukkah, and I'm talking about even Jews that celebrate Hanukkah that don't believe in the Messiah, it's typically celebrated as in the same spirit that we're celebrating Christmas. You're giving gifts, you're partying, you're having people over. On the Hanukkah side, there's, the cooking of certain foods, the dreidels, the music, basically the same thing as Christmas. And it's unfortunate because the real story has kind of gotten pushed to the side and isn't really, spoken of as much. And so we're gonna be reading this entire book today. It's a thin book, but we're gonna read the entire thing because I really, really, really feel like the story of Hanukkah can very much be applied to what is going on today in the world, particularly in America. I'm in America. I know some of you are not. I know some of you are out of the United States, but I'm sure it's probably going on in your countries as well. Several countries that I know of it is. So I'm pretty sure we can all relate to it because it's happening on a global scale. Sort of the same thing, a little bit of the same thing, or a lot of bit of the same thing is happening today. And that's why I think it's very timely, and I think it's important because these are the events that happened a couple of hundred years before Messiah ever came on the scene. And we have a gap in our Bibles between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. There's this gap. There's this gap of time where there's no writings, there's no history. We don't know what goes on. All of a sudden you have the Old Covenant, and then all of a sudden, Yeshua appears on the scene, and it seems like he's trying to change the Old Covenant, and that's not really what was going on. So I think it's important to have this fill in a little bit of space so we get a better understanding of what was happening during that time. I did want to let everybody know, anybody who I've been communicating with in private messenger, if you're watching, those packages are going to go out this week. I wasn't able to get any packages out this week. I don't think I'll be able to get there tomorrow because the post office is closed tomorrow, but probably Tuesday. Any of the packages that I have spoken about to anyone in private messenger, I'll be getting those out hopefully on Tuesday. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this book because we have a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to do that, okay? So this is the preface of the book. It's called A Burning Passion, and it says, these days, it's the Jewish version of Christmas, just like I was discussing. It's basically considered the Jewish version of Christmas, and it's kind of celebrated in a similar manner. Parties, lights, family, food, gifts, and fairy tales. Like its companion Christian holiday, Hanukkah is typically celebrated with great exuberant joy, but with little attention to the reason for the season. At the heart of Hanukkah is a story that you and I cannot afford to miss. A story of assimilation, oppression, conviction, self-sacrifice, and victory. But above all, dedication. And actually, the word Hanukkah means dedication. It's actually also called the Feast of Dedication because, as you will see in the story, the temple was rededicated after it was desecrated. So it's also referred to as the Festival of Lights and the Feast of Dedication. Hanukkah means dedication. While not a divinely instituted feast, so it's not a feast day like was commanded by God, like you are commanded to follow these feast days, the peculiar holiday of Hanukkah has nevertheless captured the hearts and imaginations of many a Jew. So, and now I will tell you, the book is written by a Messianic Jew. So it's written from a Jewish perspective, but he is Messianic. So he believes that Yeshua is the Messiah. He's very much accepting of Jesus as the Messiah, as the Mashiach. So I want to preface that before I go on. But this holiday is celebrated much like Purim. And if you've ever heard of the holiday Purim, it's not a holy feast day that was commanded by God. And Purim is the story of Esther. And if you read the story of Esther at the very end, it just became a tradition after that to celebrate it in remembrance of what God did. So even though it's not commanded by God as a holy feast day, it's a commemoration of what God did at that time. It has risen from the minor festival status to become perhaps the most widely celebrated Jewish holiday of the year. Surely this is due, in no small part, to its falling squarely during the annual Christmas season. In the many nations of the world where Jews reside and Christmas is king, the phenomenal influence upon Hanukkah has been inescapable. As a holiday season, Christmas time has stupefyingly become accessible for Jews. So basically, even though Jews consider themselves to be the ones celebrating Hanukkah and not Christmas, over time it has come to be a very much, very much a acceptable thing for Jews to celebrate Christmas. There are Jews all over the world who don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, but they celebrate Christmas because Christmas has become so commercialized that it's not really even about that. He was born that day, even though he wasn't born that day. We won't get into that, but this is why it's very acceptable for a lot of people to celebrate it who are not Christians. I find this not only astounding, but troubling. It's nothing against Christmas per se, and certainly nothing against the idea of Jews celebrating Yeshua, whom Christmas is supposed to be about. I am concerned simply by the fact that something so naturally foreign to the people of Israel, in this case a Christian holiday, has once again become embedded in our collective culture and consciousness. Consider this personal anecdote. During a recent Hanukkah pass, I was asked by an acquaintance about my plans for the holiday. My smart aleck response reflected an inner dismay. I'm going to do with my kids what my parents did with me. Take them driving to look at Christmas lights. And many Jews who do not consider themselves to be Christians, do the same thing. They go and they look at Christmas lights. This is a perfect picture of how Jews celebrate Hanukkah and Christmas in the United States of America. Christ, we don't want. Messiah, we don't want. But Christmas is for everybody. So it's very obvious that Christmas has become so commercialized and so unreligionized, I'm just going to make that word up, that it's acceptable for everybody. There's people of every walk of faith that celebrate Christmas, even though they do not accept Jesus at all. Everyone can share in the spirit of Christmas. But while peace on earth and goodwill towards men may be the unwittingly messianic mantra of Jew and Christian alike, the sentiment reflects more than the adoption of the spirit of Christmas. It also reveals evidence of the spirit of assimilation, hard at work among the Jewish populace. In other words, assimilating to the world. This is not about assimilating to Christianity anymore. It's about assimilating to the world, as Christians have done also. This should be the source of our disquiet, especially given the irony that Jewish self-assimilation is where the real story of Hanukkah begins. So it's very ironic because the story of Hanukkah is about not assimilating to the world who was trying to perpetrate its ways upon the Jews at the time, and yet celebrating Christmas, assimilating to the world, and not really celebrating the meaning of Hanukkah. When I gaze upon the Hanukkah lights, my thoughts are not of miracles and merriment, but of the fire that still blazes in the heart of God, yearning for my people to return wholeheartedly to Him. I think of those my kin who fought and died for His name, refusing to forget that Yehovah set them apart for a purpose. And I think of those who dwell today in presumed safety and freedom to live as we please, having forgotten who God made us to be. You may know next to nothing about the Feast of Dedication. You may love and cherish, or you may love and cherish it as a meaningful time of year. My aim with this message is not to dash your view of Hanukkah upon the rocks. Instead, my hope is that you will be stirred and inspired to abandon all that has doused your fire for God, and to be reignited with a burning passion for righteousness, holiness, and zealous life for Yehovah, or Yahweh, however you say His name, for the Lord. May the real story of Hanukkah cause you to wholly commit yourself to God, to be restored to who He has made you to be, forsaking everything you hold dear, and even yourself, devoted and dedicated to death. So what is Hanukkah? Wintertime on Israel's scriptural calendar is marked by the distinct lack of annual appointed times. So we have appointed times in the spring, and we have appointed holy days in the fall, but in the wintertime there are no holy days. There's no appointed times. Unlike the bustling modern winter holiday schedule of the West, this season is supposed to be a time of preparation and dormancy for Israel. Between the end of Israel's year in autumn and its renewal in the spring, only weekly Sabbaths or Shabbats and monthly new moons pepper the nearly 6-month period. There's like a 6-month period of just no holy days. The exceptions to this pattern arise not from divine injunction, but by the will of the people of Israel to celebrate and memorialize significant events in the nation's history. Aside from a few minor days, the most notable Jewish events of this period are Purim and, of course, Hanukkah. Purim happens before Passover, which is like in February-ish. Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, commemorates the victory of Judah Maccabee and his band of Jewish freedom fighters over Israel's Greco-Syrian oppressors during the 2nd century BC. So this was BC, the 2nd century, like 200 years before Messiah came. Okay, and there was a so Greek and Syrian empire that was oppressing Israel at the time. In the course of foreign occupation, Israel's temple was defiled by pagan sacrifices. But upon the retaking of Jerusalem, the temple was purified and rededicated, a triumph worthy of the victor's institution of the 8-day annual celebration and remembrance. Okay, so this is why we celebrate it for 8 days. Known also as the Festival of Lights, Hanukkah begins each year on the 25th day of the 9th month, in the month of Kislev. Remember, the biblical calendar goes by numbers and not really names, so it was the 25th day of the 9th month on the Jewish calendar, corresponding roughly to the month December. While Hanukkah is considered an important historical holiday among the Jewish people, it is today a popular and commonly practiced celebration and does not find its origins in Scripture. Rather, the modern observance centered on the 9-branched Hanukkah. So basically, I don't want you to get confused, but you'll see during Hanukkah, they'll say light the menorah, but technically the menorah is the 7-branch menorah, which is very biblical. It was always in the temple. There was always a 7-branch menorah. The 9-branch menorah is actually called the Hanukkah, which is distinctly different from the menorah. But mostly because it has 9 branches and not 7. And this modern observance actually comes from the Talmud. So what is Hanukkah? And you can find this part of Hanukkah, which is the reason why Jews celebrate it today, is actually located in the Talmud. And it says, within the framework of historical events, this is what they say happened. The rabbis taught on the 25th day of Kislev, Hanukkah commences the last 8 days in which lamenting and commemoration of the dead and fasting are prohibited. The Hellenists, or the Greeks, entered the sanctuary of the temple. They defiled all the oil that was found there. This is the oil that was used for the menorah in the temple. When the government of the house of the Asmoneans prevailed and conquered them, the oil was sought to feed the holy lamp, or the actual menorah, in the sanctuary, and 1 vial was found with the seal of the high priest intact. So there was a seal for the high priest still intact, so it had not been defiled yet. The vial contained sufficient oil for 1 day only, but a miracle occurred, and it fed the holy lamp 8 days in succession. These 8 days were the following year established as good days of cheer, in which psalms of praise and acknowledgement of God's wonders were to be recited. So this is the typical story of Hanukkah that you hear today, is that there was enough oil for 1 day and it lasted for 8 days. This can only be found in the Talmud. It's not in the book of Maccabees. It's not in the stories or the historical references of Hanukkah in Josephus. So it is almost thought that this may have been added later on and probably did not happen, the miracle of the oil. But you'll see later on that the miracle of the oil is not the real miracle of Hanukkah. And that's not truly the reason why we should be celebrating it. So according to the Talmud, Hanukkah is the celebration and miracle and commemorance of a miracle. The days of Hanukkah commemorate the miraculous 8-day burning of a single day's oil, hence the kindling of the Hanukkah lights for 8 successive nights. This is the commonly taught and universally accepted explanation and meaning and purpose of Hanukkah. Unfortunately, there is a discrepancy. Were we to assign the Talmud authority on par with the scripture, there would be no cause to doubt the veracity of this miraculous claim. The account of the Hanukkah miracle could be accepted as fact, and we could joyfully celebrate and promote its regular remembrance according to the tradition. But, if the events referred to in the Talmud's definition of Hanukkah, all of them are verifiable by historical sources. So everything in the Talmud, everything in the Talmud regarding the story of Hanukkah can be verified by historical sources except the miracle of the oil. Indeed, this miracle may well be complete fabrication. It's very possible that it was completely made up, considering its nagging absence from the earlier historical accounts, which we will soon consult in detail. So what should our response be? Did a miracle really happen there? Perhaps, perhaps not. Maybe it didn't. What is certain is that the historical documents of the period make absolute no mention of it, and yet the fabled happening is the core of all Talmudic Hanukkah ritual and observance. So the one thing that's not mentioned in any other historical references is the main focus of the celebration of Hanukkah. So if the rabbi's assertion regarding the definition of Hanukkah is dubious, what then is Hanukkah truly all about? The real story of Hanukkah, or as close as we will ever come to it, is recorded in the ancient Jewish writings, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Excuse me. 1st and 2nd Maccabees, two of the intertestamental manuscript catalog among the infamous Apocrypha. I'm just going to pause there for a second. Hold on. And just as a side note, I personally have, from what I've studied and what I've learned about 1st and 2nd Maccabees, believe it to be something that you can trust. 3rd and 4th Maccabees, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about those, but I feel like 1st and 2nd Maccabees does a good job of being more authentic. So the Apocrypha is a collection of writings included in the Septuagint, the Jewish translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. So the Septuagint were the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek by Hebrews. It is also contained in the Latin Vulgate, a Catholic translation. Though originally part of the King James Bible and still included in modern Catholic versions, Jews and Protestant Christians do not consider the books of the Apocrypha to be divinely inspired, nor to carry the weight of scriptural authority. And this is something that I've been trying to preface in almost every time that I mention any other book outside of the Bible. I try to preface that we're using it not as something that is going to create new doctrine or additional doctrine or any other theological teachings. We're using it as a historical reference, just like we would use the historical reference of Josephus, because he was a historian during a certain period of time. So this is the reason for reading them and discussing them at all, is just for a history of what was happening during that time. But even though the 1st and 2nd Maccabees are included in the Apocrypha, and not in the canon of Hebrew scriptures, they are nevertheless considered authoritative accounts. So something can be like in a historical account of something, but maybe not considered inspired by the Holy Spirit or inspired by God as to be held at that same level as other scriptures. Does that make sense? Their value, therefore, is primarily as historical documents. So, to this end and this end alone, we may freely consult and rely upon them. First and Second Maccabees tell essentially the same story from two different perspectives by two separate authors. Kind of like you have Mark, John, Matthew giving accounts, but from different authors. First Maccabees is primarily a factual account, while Second Maccabees offers a more theological interpretation or explanation of the Hanukkah events. Both books are apparently written by Jewish authors, neither of whose identities are known. We do not know who wrote them. Though First and Second Maccabees are not scriptural writings, they are nevertheless powerful written historical accounts of the real story of Hanukkah. Indeed, from a purely literary standpoint, the details and descriptions of these writings rival and perhaps even surpass that of Scripture in their graphic recounting of the persecution of the Jewish people and the trampling of Jehovah's Torah by the Gentiles and Jews. This is what happened. So, a word about the Torah. In order to fully appreciate and comprehend the motivating force behind the Hanukkah heroes' intense zeal, depth of loyalty, and commitment towards the God of Israel, it's very necessary to expound briefly on their apparent fervor for the law of Moses, otherwise known as the Torah. This is important to know because then you won't understand why they were so zealous and willing to sacrifice their lives against the Greek overlords. For the Jew at that time, the Torah is supposed to symbolize Israel's fidelity to God. Okay, this is important to understand. It represents our real, actual connection and relationship to Him, such that if one single command of the Torah is abrogated or defiled, it is as if the Holy One Himself has been desecrated. This sentiment is ingrained in the scriptures as exhibited by these choice examples. I'm going to read a couple examples that explain where this comes from. So in Proverbs 28:9, it says, "One who turns his ear from even hearing the Torah, even his prayer is an abomination." How many of you have heard this Proverbs? This is Proverbs 28:9. If one even turns his ear from hearing the Torah, hearing God's law, even his prayer is an abomination. Or in Jeremiah 6:19, it says, "Hear, O earth, behold, I am bringing evil on this people, the fruit of their thoughts. For to my words they gave no attention, and my Torah they kicked against it." Or in Ezekiel 22:26, it says, "Israel's priests have done violence to my Torah, and I am profaned in their midst." So God was calling Himself profaned because Israel profaned the Torah. Because you have to understand, the Torah was the covenant, was their covenant with God. It's like you breaking your marriage covenant with your spouse. There are things that you're required to do, ways that you're required to act in a marital relationship, and this is very similar to the relationship with God, only on a different level. The Master Yeshua, or Jesus Himself, speaking more than a century and a half after the Hanukkah events, shared the same reverence and esteem for the Torah, evidenced by His sobering words in Matthew 5:17 through 19. This is what Jesus said. This is Yeshua speaking. Do not suppose I have come to throw down the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For I say to you, until the time that the heaven and earth pass away, not one yod or stroke will pass away from the Torah. Until that time that all comes to pass. Whoever therefore unbinds one of these commandments, or in other translations it says, whoever therefore disobeys one of these commandments, even the least of these commandments, and teaches men to do so, he will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them, he will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So don't get confused and think that Yeshua, Jesus Christ, was opposed to the Torah. The Torah was considered very sacred and holy. And even following the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Yeshua, tens of thousands of Messianic Jews continued to be zealous for the Torah, as attested in Acts 21:20. 21:20 says, "You see, brother, how many tens of thousands there are of Jews who have believed that Yeshua is the Messiah, and all are zealous for the Torah." Okay? Sorry, let me get some water. I'm still battling a little cold thing. For Jews then, defiling of the Torah, not a physical Torah scroll, but the teachings and the commands of the Torah itself, amounts to an incursion against the very sanctity and authority of Yehovah himself. This is the filter through which we need to understand the role of the Torah in the Hanukkah story. Okay? The heroes of Hanukkah were not motivated by a loveless legalism, because every time somebody hears the word law or Torah, they think, oh, the cold legalistic, you're just legalistic, and this is not true. You can be legalistic and not even follow God's commands. The heroes of Hanukkah were not motivated by a loveless legalism or a misplaced religious fervor, but by an overwhelming zeal for the one true God, a zeal that was maintained by their covenantal connection through Yahweh's or Yehovah's Torah. Today, the occasional passing homage to the real story of Hanukkah is too often lost in the buzz of wintertime festivities, and as a result, what many do not remember about Hanukkah is its unsettling, unsanitized, and all too important origins. The real story of Hanukkah is a story of turmoil and upheaval for the nation of Israel. And you're going to see how this is very applicable for us today. I want you to see this. It is a story about the attempted assimilation of the Jewish people and the anti-Semitic spirit against them. It is a story of sin and corruption, oppression and persecution, liberty and ultimately victory. The real story of Hanukkah begins not with spinning tops, glowing lights, and miracles, but with the lustful and voluntary Hellenization of Israel. In the first book of Maccabees opens with a brief introduction to the Greek leaders who came to power in the 2nd century BC. During this time, the Jewish people had already returned from exile, so they had returned from exile from Babylon to the land of Israel, yet were enduring a series of foreign occupations. So they came back from Babylon, from exile, but they were still constantly under foreign occupations and never really were at rest. Beginning in 1 Maccabees 1:10, we meet the latest of Israel's foreign dictators responsible for exposing Israel to Greek Hellenistic way of life. And it says here, There sprang from these rulers a sinful offshoot, Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of King Antiochus. Once a hostage at Rome, he became king in the year 137 of the kingdom of the Greeks. And this is why I try to sort of always mention the historical side of things, because it's important to know the history. If you don't understand the history behind it, you don't really fully understand what's going on. In the political and cultural climate fostered under the sinful offshoot Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jewish people began to test the waters of personal liberty. I'm going to say that again. I'm so sorry, but I have to clear my throat. I'm going to say this again because I feel like it's very important. In the political and cultural climate fostered under the sinful offshoot Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jewish people began to test the waters of personal liberty as they explored alternative lifestyles outside of godly boundaries. Comment below if you can tell me what that sounds like to you. A vocal activist minority within Israel, those who were overtly and shamelessly defiling the Torah, paraded their transgressions before the general public, inciting them to go astray. So there was a small group of people in Israel who decided to side with the Greeks and were overtly, shamelessly parading and defiling the Torah in front of the population, trying to get them to go astray. And verse 11 in Maccabees continues. It says, "In those days there appeared in Israel Jewish men who were breakers of the Torah. And they seduced many people, saying, 'Let us go and make an alliance with the Gentiles all around us. Since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us.'" Preying partly upon people's fear over Gentile occupation, partly upon their latent appetite for the taboo, because they were very curious about these Greek ways. The agenda being promoted to the populace was cloyingly simple. Let us go the way of the nations and forsake our Jewishness. For our own profit and pleasure, let us forsake Yehovah and his Torah. Not through oppression or persecution did the people of Israel reach this contorted conclusion, but out of a spirit of assimilation. Enticed by the prospect of a new, alluring lifestyle, the people of Israel began to throw off the oppression of the Torah while courting the freedom of the Gentiles. Verse 12 through 15 in 1 Maccabees says, "The proposal was agreeable. Some from among the Jewish people promptly went to the king, and he authorized them to introduce the way of living of the Gentiles. Thereupon, they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, according to the Gentile custom," because this was very much a Greek and Roman custom to build gymnasiums. "They covered over the mark of their circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant, and they aligned themselves with the Gentiles and sold themselves into wrongdoing." The people of Israel began to voluntarily ally themselves with the Greeks and their alien customs. They took upon themselves a foreign lifestyle, the way of living of the Gentiles, in order to hide their identity as Jews and assimilate away from the culture of Israel. In their vain attempt to conceal their birthright and heritage, the men would cover over the mark of their circumcision, because apparently there was a lot of, when you're in the gymnasium, the men were naked, getting dressed. I don't know if they were showering. They weren't. They weren't showering in a regular shower. But the Greeks liked to be naked a lot back then. They were very proud of their nakedness. The Greeks were, and they were very much into the physical. So the Jews had to cover their circumcision so that they could hide that they were Jews. In this way and more, many in Israel abandoned the Holy Covenant, and in the eyes of the author, sold themselves into wrongdoing. Meanwhile, in the upper echelons of Jewish politics, one man bought his way into wrongdoing and favor with Antiochus Epiphanes. According to 2 Maccabees 4:7-9, Jason, this is an important figure, Jason, the brother of Onias, who was the high priest. Onias was the high priest, Jason was his brother, and obviously Jason had taken on a different name, because Jason is not a Hebrew name. So he had taken on a Greek name, supplanted his brother by bribing his way into office. So Jason becomes high priest by bribing his way into office through Antiochus Epiphanes. So now we have a false high priest over Israel. And this is what it says in 2 Maccabees. But Seleucus died, and when Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, succeeded him on the throne, Onias's brother Jason obtained the high priesthood by corrupt means. In an interview, he promised the king 360 talents of silver, as well as 80 talents from another source of income. Besides this, he agreed to pay 150 more if he were given authority to establish a gymnasium and a youth club for it, to enroll Jewish men in Jerusalem as Antiochans. Hey, Sandy, I'm so glad you can make it. Janelle, shalom. Shabbat shalom, guys. I'm so glad you're here. So Jason's thirst for position and power was apparently matched only by his lust to lead Israel to the Greek way of life. He led the way in the establishment of the gymnasium, coveting athletics as the path to naturalized citizenship. So they were enticing the Jews with athletics to becoming more Greek-like. Sandy said, I'm late, but I made it. Hallelujah. I'm just glad you're here. I'm just glad you were able to make any of it. We're about a third of the way through. Not quite halfway. Verses 10-12 continue to expound on the results of Jason's degenerate ways. Sorry, I couldn't get that out. So this is what it says. When Jason received the king's approval and came into office, he immediately initiated his countrymen into the Greek way of life. He set aside the royal concessions granted to the Jews through the mediation of John, who was the father of Eupolemus. He abrogated the lawful institutions and introduced customs contrary to the Torah. Montiveros, shalom. So glad you were able to make it. Glad to see you guys here. So he introduced customs contrary to the Torah, and he's a Jew himself, now falsely running, as high priest right now. He quickly established a gymnasium at the very foot of the Acropolis, right next to the temple. So the brother of the high priest becomes corrupt, builds a gymnasium right next to the temple. Could that be any worse of a bad move? Where he induced the noblest young Jewish men to wear the Greek hat. Like the young men of Israel shamelessly disrobing for the athletic field, Israel's unique national identity was being swiftly stripped away. Israel's wantonness for the ways of the nations climaxed in a frenzy for sports. I'm going to say that again. Israel's Israel's wantonness for the ways of the nations climaxed in a frenzy for sports, a literal celebration of the flesh, such that even the priests left their service in the temple to participate in the games. Second Maccabees reveals this. It says, the craze for Hellenism and foreign customs reached such a pitch through the outrageous wickedness of the ungodly pseudo-high priest Jason, who was the brother of the actual high priest, that the priests no longer cared about the service of the altar. Disdaining the temple and neglecting the sacrifices, they hastened at the signal for the discuss throwing to take part in the unlawful exercises on the athletic field. So they're leaving the priestly duties in the temple to exercises on the athletic field. They despised what their ancestors had regarded as honors, while they highly prized what the Greeks esteemed as glory. The self-corruption of Israel had infected every level of Jewish society. Not even those dedicated to Jehovah's service were immune. This, unfortunately, was only the latest of many such periods in the sad but true history of the Jewish people. Why had they gone crazy for Hellenism? Well, why not? From the beginning, Israel's default position has been to abandon our calling as God's own people in order to hotly pursue the ways of the nations. They had just come back from Babylon. Why were they taken into Babylon? Because they had become like the nations around them. And here they are again, not standing up for what they believe. Not standing up for what they believe. You cannot read your Bible and get past the fact that God honors those who are zealous for him and his word. You cannot read the Bible and get past that fact. God honors those who stick up for him and are not swayed by the world. Let's continue. One might think that since Israel was under occupation during that time, they couldn't help but be seduced away from the things of God. Perhaps you could think that. Perhaps there was even an element of simply wanting to blend in with the society around them, possibly in the hopes of staving off potential persecution. You could say they just didn't want to be persecuted anymore. So let's just kind of go with it. Just go with it. Just go with it. Indeed, this is a reasonable presumption, given Israel's history as an often oppressed, enslaved, invaded, and exiled people. Yet the record makes no pretense about certain assimilating forces clearly at work. The people were breaking the Torah and adopting foreign customs. They were encouraged and induced by a corrupt high priest to forsake Israel's ways, and they were enamored, perhaps even unnaturally aroused by the spectacle of the Greek athletic lifestyle. Maybe they thought, hey, I just like it. In short, they were Jews who no longer wanted to be Jews. An ongoing identity crisis that would once again be their undoing. Verses 16 and 17 in Maccabees says, precisely because of this, they found themselves in serious trouble. The very people whose manner of life they emulated and whom they desired to imitate in everything became their enemies and oppressors. It is no light matter to flout the Torah of God, as the following period will show. Serious trouble. When the Lord causes calamity to fall upon Israel, it is never with the intention to completely obliterate her, but to bring correction and cause her to return to him. Same as it says in Proverbs 3:12. For whomever the Lord loves, he disciplines, even as a father disciplines the son with whom he is pleased. Indeed, even after Israel had been taken to captivity several hundred years before the present events, the Lord spoke words of restoration, assurances that his punishment would eventually end, and a remnant would soon come home. Jeremiah 3:12 says, Go and proclaim these words towards the north and say, Turn back, O backsliding Israel, an affirmation of the Lord. I will cause not my anger to fall upon you any longer, for I am kind. An affirmation of the Lord. I keep not my anger to the age. In other words, I'm not going to be angry forever. Such is the sentiment of the authors in 2 Maccabees 6:12 through 17, where he suggests that Israel's serious trouble was not only for her own good, but less than it would have been for any other nation. In other words, well, though his commandments cannot be taken as divine declaration, the idea of punishment as correction does have scriptural precedent. Consequently, this may have been the case for Israel during this particular time in question. The author says, Now I beg those who read this book not to be disheartened by these misfortunes, but to consider that these chastisements were meant not for ruin, but for correction of our nation. It is in fact a sign of great kindness to punish sinners promptly instead of letting them go for long. So it's much more beneficial for God to correct us immediately when we start going off into sin a little bit than to wait for us to go fully into sin and wait for our punishment to be great. Thus, in dealing with other nations, the Lord patiently waits until they reach the full measure of their sins before he punishes them. But with us, Israel, or those in covenant who have been grafted into Israel, he has decided to deal differently, in order that he may not have to punish us more severely later, when our sins have reached their fullness. He never withdraws his mercy from us. Although he disciplines us with misfortunes, he does not abandon his people completely. Were the leading events of the Hanukkah story simply a precursor to one more in a long line of chastisements? Considering that less than 2 centuries later, the Lord would be sending his Son not only to redeem Israel, but save all mankind. It seems a plausible 11th hour attempt to restore the Jewish people to their messianic purpose. God's plan for Israel has always been for us to help save and reconcile the nations of the earth back to him. Yet here again, the sons of Israel were zealously going the ways of the nations, failing to be the peculiar people we were meant to be. Yes, we were meant to be peculiar. It says that all throughout the Bible. And if you're uncomfortable with being peculiar, you might want to rethink your walk. Needless to say, Israel's willful assimilation into the Greek way of life did indeed lead to serious trouble. It says, Let these words suffice for recalling this truth. Without further ado, we must go on with our story. So, what are the consequences of assimilation? One can only imagine Israel's relief and delight at the birth of this new world order. Safe from the tyranny of the Gentiles, they could now melt into the Greek culture and society, shedding the natural and spiritual distinctiveness that had been barricaded them from the peace and pleasure they so shamelessly sought. Unfortunately, the price they would ultimately pay for their new way of life was far greater than anyone could have foreseen. Having propped open the door of self-assimilation, Israel had inadvertently extended an invitation to the forces of anti-Semitism. So you think that because you're becoming like the world, assimilating assimilating to the world, that they're not going to persecute you. It's not true. In short order, Antiochus Epiphanes slaughtered many of the people of Israel. He plundered the city of Jerusalem, taking women, children, and livestock captive. But even this was apparently not enough to shake many of the surviving Jews out of their collective delusion. I'm telling you, this is going on in America right now. Spellbound, they continued to embrace the growing influence of paganism, falling in line with each fashionable trend. As the conqueror of many nations, of which Israel was only one, Antiochus Epiphanes advanced his comprehensive and blazoned reform. In 1 Maccabees 1:41 through 43, it says, "Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, each abandoning his particular customs." This is happening right now, guys. This is happening right now. We should all become one people, all abandoning our particular customs. All the Gentiles conformed to the command of the king, and many Israelites were in favor of his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. The widespread adoption of Antiochus Epiphanes' one world religion could seal the fate not only of Israel, but of all the surrounding nations. Blind to or intentionally disregarding the effects of their collaboration, many Israelites favored the king's religion. They proceeded to heap the debasement of the one true God upon their newfound Gentile ways. With so many Jews already in league with Antiochus, the king, the next step in securing Israeli acceptance of his religion was to make the keeping of the Torah and the continuation of the temple service crimes against the state. I'm going to repeat that. The next step to securing Israeli acceptance of his religion was to make the keeping of the Torah and the continuation of the temple service crimes against the state. Verses 44 through 50 enumerate the new laws that were enacted upon the Jewish people. I want you to pay attention to this, okay? These were the new laws that were enacted upon the Jewish people. The king sent messengers with letters to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow customs foreign to their land. This is what they were. To prohibit burnt offerings, sacrifices, drink offerings, and the sanctuary. So no more temple services. To profane the Sabbaths and the feast days. To profane the Sabbaths and the feast days. Who else has done that throughout history? To desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers. To build pagan altars and temples and shrines. To sacrifice swine and unclean animals. To sacrifice swine, pigs, or unclean animals. To leave their sons uncircumcised. And to let themselves be defiled with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they might forget the Torah and change all of their observances. Whoever refuted to act accordingly to the command of the king should be put to death. Prohibitions against sacrifices, purposeful profaning of the holy days, deliberate desecration of the sacred places, identity theft of the next generation. By the abolition or abrogation of anything related to the Torah and the temple service, everything that defined and distinguished Israel from the nations would be eliminated. The king's scheme was ingenious, the goal astonishingly self-evident. The goal of the king was to cause the Jews to forget who they were. and one can rule the world. To accomplish this feat, however, Antiochus could not rely on people's fleshly passions and weaknesses alone. For those who couldn't be manipulated through their own lusts and desires, in other words, those Israelis who were not enticed by the Greek ways, there would be forced submission to the new order upon pain of death. Such is the natural progression when we make the choice to assimilate. Eventually, compulsory compliance will come. Jews who were breakers of the Torah quickly joined with the Antiochans to enforce the king's new laws. So now you have Jews, you have Israelis siding with the king to enforce the king's laws upon other Jews. The people of Israel were driven into hiding, hoping to avoid persecution while remaining faithful to the Jewish way of life. But unfortunately, it was not to be. In 1 Maccabees 1:54 through 55, it says, on the 15th day on the month of Kislev, in the year 145, the king erected the horrible abomination upon the altar of burning offerings. And in the surrounding cities of Judah, they built pagan altars. They also burnt incense at the doors of houses and in the streets. While the physical landscape of the landmarks of Israel were being successfully distorted and defaced, the psychological warfare against the Hebrew mindset raged. The stage was set for everything that would come next. As verses 56 through 61 says, any scrolls of the Torah which were found, they tore up and they burnt. Whoever was found with the scroll of the covenant, and whoever observed the Torah, was condemned to death by royal decree. So they used their power against Israel, against those who were caught each month in the cities. On the 25th day of each month, they sacrificed on the altar erected over the altar of burnt offerings. Women who had had their children sacrificed were put to death. Women who had their children circumcised. If any woman had their child circumcised, they were put to death, in keeping with the king's decree, with the babies hung from their necks, and their families also, and those who had circumcised them were killed. Okay? Here we go. Censorship, witch hunts, executions, the butchery of the innocent, the beaten path of assimilation, once so willingly trodden by some, was now the road of forced passage and a death march for the rest. The immoral alternative lifestyle, previously dismissed and tolerated in Israel, had suddenly become the religion of the state, with all else outlawed and forbidden. This is happening. This is happening in America right now, and all over the world. Because believers, Jews and Christians alike, have tolerated for so long these sinful ways being perpetrated and pushed upon the people that now it's going to become the law of the land, and you're not going to be able to practice what you believe. The traitorous, being Jewish, retaining any semblance of the unique, distinct peoplehood of Israel, was now officially a crime. Guess what? It's going to be a crime in America too. The traitorous, individualist assimilation of yesterday was no longer a free choice for the people. Now it's no longer a choice for you to act godly or not act godly. Now it's the law. Now that they've gotten a hold on everything. Now for the entire nation, there was only one option: convert or die. And die they did. And yet in the face of death and imminent erasure of the entire nation of Israel, the embers of righteousness defiantly glowed. Many would lose their lives standing firm for the Lord, but their deaths would spark a revolution to restore faithfulness to the people of God. Does this sound like the book of Revelations to you? I say Revelations. The book of Revelation to you of what's going to happen in the end times? A tragic chapter of the story of Israel was coming to a close. In 1 Maccabees 1:62 through 63, it says this. But many in Israel were determined and resolved in their hearts not to eat anything unclean. They preferred to die rather than to be defiled with unclean food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Terrible affliction was upon Israel. So what happens? What happens after this? The spirit of anti-Semitism, fueled by the flames of assimilation, burned wildly against the sons of Jacob. But even as many were crushed by the evils of oppression, a few would reignite the people's fire for God. Chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees introduces the man credited with striking that match. In those days, Mattisyahu, the son of Yohanan, or John, son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Joarib, left Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He had 5 sons, including Yehuda, or Judah, who was called Ha-Maccabee. When he saw the sacrileges that were being committed in Judah and in Jerusalem, he said, "Woe is me! Why was I born to see the ruin of my people and the ruin of the holy city, and to sit idle while it is given into the hands of the enemies, and the sanctuary into the hands of strangers? Her temple has become like a man disgraced. Her glorious ornaments have been carried off as spoils. Her infants have been murdered in her streets, her young men by the sword of the enemy. What nation has not taken its share of her realm, and it laid its hands on her possessions? All her adornment has been taken away. From being free, she has become a slave. We see our sanctuary and our beauty, and our glory laid waste, and the Gentiles have defiled them. Why are we still alive?" Mattisyahu, a faithful priest and father, lamented Israel's ruin and his overwhelming sense of helplessness to stop it. He felt like, what am I supposed to do? It's like what's going on in America today. You feel like, what are we supposed to do? Can we do anything? It's better than doing nothing. When the officers of the king arrived to compel the people to make the sacrifices to idols, they were met with a visibly resistant Mattisyahu. So they're coming to Mattisyahu and his family in order to make them sacrifice to idols. But sensing his antagonism, they attempted to appeal to him on a level they wholly expected would reach any Jew. So check this out. In 1 Maccabees 2:15 through 18, it says, "The officers of the king in charge of enforcing the apostasy came to the city of Modin to organize the sacrifices. Many of Israel joined them, but Mattisyahu and his sons gathered in a group apart. Then the officers of the king addressed Mattisyahu and said, 'You are a leader, an honorable and great man in this city, supported by sons and kinsmen. Come now, be the first to obey the king's command, and all the Gentiles and the men of Judah and those who are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons shall be numbered among the king's friends, and shall be enriched with silver, gold, and many gifts.'" Is this not happening in America today? Is there not certain people in America today that are promising you money and a rich, nice, comfortable, everybody's going to have everything. Don't worry, we're going to give you money and we're going to take care of you and everything's going to be free? Yeah, sure. Just become like us. The officers dangled the carrots of flattery, prestige, and obscene wealth before what they must have certainly have thought to be just another corruptible Jew. They thought, he's like every other Jew. We can just entice him with these things. They also endeavored to cajole Matisyahu into compliance by pressuring him to conform to the ways of his peers. But with this Jew, trying to capitalize on men's usual weaknesses would prove to be a serious miscalculation. In appealing to his flesh, they succeeded only in unleashing. In trying to appeal to his flesh, they succeeded only in unleashing the unquenchable righteousness zeal of God. According to 1 Maccabees 1:19 through 28, it says, Matisyahu answered the officers in a loud voice, although all the Gentiles in the king's realm obey him, so that each forsakes the religion of his fathers and consents to the king's orders. Yet I and my sons and my kinsmen will keep the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the Torah and the commandments. We will not obey the words of the king, nor depart from our religion in the slightest degree. As he finished saying these words, a certain Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifices. So he's speaking these words to the officer, and then a Jew comes forward in the sight of everyone to offer sacrifices on the altar in Modin according to the king's order. So a Jew comes out of the crowd to offer sacrifices to an idol, and this is what happens. When Matisyahu saw this man, this Jew, sacrificing to idols, he was filled with zeal. His heart was moved, and his just fury was aroused. He sprang forward and killed him upon the altar. Killed him. Just like whoever is watching right now, who else do you know in the Bible had such zeal for God that they killed someone and God blessed them for doing such a thing? Type in the comments if you know who it is. Give me his name. At the same time, he also killed the messenger of the king who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. This guy went nutso on them. Thus he showed his zeal for the Torah, just as, okay, I'll give you the answer. Just as Pinehas did with Zimri, son of Zalhu. Remember Pinehas or Pineas? Sandy said Adam. No, Pinehas was the one who killed the man and woman. So one of the Jews went to sleep. This was in the wilderness, while they were in the wilderness, traveling towards, coming out of Egypt, traveling towards the Promised Land. And there was in the surrounding area, there was Canaanite women who were trying to entice the Israelites. And one of the Israelis went to go sleep with one of the females who was luring them. And Pinehas went in there and stabbed both of them through with his sword, and it went through both of them at the same time while they were together in the tent. And they call it the biblical shish kebab because he stabbed both of them through at the same time. Excuse me. Then Matisyahu went through the city shouting, "Let everyone who is zealous for the Torah and who stands by the covenant follow after me." Thereupon he fled to the mountains with his sons, leaving behind in the city all their possessions. In a spontaneous burst of violent, unrestrained fervor, Matisyahu unpremeditated deeds committed him and many in Israel to their new life in the underground resistance. So basically, he started this underground movement to rebel. At the same time, they brought Matisyahu to the good and eternal company of the blessed, singly devoted righteous ones of Israel. Can we condemn Matisyahu as a murderer, misconstruing his actions as some sort of misplaced religious fanaticism? Was he just a religious fanatic? Was he wrong? Was Matisyahu wrong for doing this? They're forcing him to sacrifice to idols, killing all of his people. Was he wrong for doing this? Only if we ignore the very Torah he was championing. championing. Can't say that. Which says in Deuteronomy 13:5, this is what it says in Deuteronomy. And you must purge the evil out from your midst. When your brother entices you in secret, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods, gods which you have not known, you and your fathers, of the gods of the people who are around about you," do not consent to him, nor listen to him, nor in your eye have pity on him, nor spare him, nor cover over him. But you must surely kill him. Your hand is to be the first on him, and the hand of all the people last. And you will stone him with stones, and he will die. For he has sought to drive you away from the Lord your God. And in all Israel will hear and fear, and add not to do an evil thing like this in your midst. In other words, God was saying, if someone entices you to go serve other gods, you are to kill him, so that everyone else in Israel will fear doing this very same thing. According to the Torah, the sons of Israel are commanded to take, without remorse, the very lives of those bent on leading them astray. We're not just talking about somebody that you come across somebody else that believes another way as you do. We're talking about people who are forcing you to go into another belief system. Particularly your brother who ought to know better. This death penalty is meant not merely as punishment against those who would desire to entice Israel away from God, but as a deterrent for anyone who might consider it in the future. You know, when there's no punishment, people aren't afraid to do things. Clearly, the concept of rewarding such a seducer with death is a scriptural one which Matisyahu obviously embraced with unadulterated and instant zeal. Let us also consider Matisyahu's actions in the context of Israel's scriptural history and the sanctioned use of lethal force for the eradication of epidemic of sin. The most famous examples follow the golden calf incident, in which within a matter of months after their deliverance from Egypt, the sons of Israel quickly and defiantly turned away from the Lord, explicitly violating the very Torah they themselves had committed to do. The people did rebellious obeisance to their fabrication, causing the Lord's anger to ablaze upon them. Had it not been for Moses' urgent intercession, all Israel would have been extinguished from the face of the earth. And the Lord's concession was nevertheless brutal. Without knowing in advance that all they would be commanded to do, only the men most committed to God answered Moses' call. Their unwavering devotion led them not to question the bloody mandate, but to carry it out willingly, immediately, and with sober enthusiasm and abundance. In exchange for being godly butchers in an ungodly, incomprehensible situation, the Levites brought neither shame nor condemnation upon themselves. Rather, they heaped blessing upon their heads. One can only hope that the massacre left Israel gripped with grief and new resolve. Unfortunately, not even the loss of 3,000 men in a single day would forever dissuade Israel from playing the harlot again and again. Indeed, led away by the lusts of the flesh, the sons of Israel continued to run after foreign gods, to their own undoing. Again, Israel turned away from the God who loved and saved them. And again, the consequences were extreme. This happened over and over and over again. Though we may prefer that our merciful King not be so severe in his correction, such is the reality of righteousness for a holy and jealous God. Since it is in this manner that the Lord responds to those who show him contempt, how much more should his servants be ready to defend his name in love, even by deadly means? Surely Matisyahu acted in the spirit of the Levites at Sinai, as well as the judges at Shittim. But it is with one man in particular, also a priest, that the author of 1 Maccabees draws his direct comparison. To reiterate his remarks, he says, "Thus Matisyahu showed zeal for the Torah, just as Phinehas did. Continuing the account involving the daughters of Moab in Numbers relates to the story of Phinehas and his extraordinary model of devotion to God. So it's going to give you in Numbers the story of Phinehas and what he did, but I'm just going to skip over that for time's sake. But Phinehas has distinguished himself not because he was willingly participated in the righteous slaughter of Israel, but because he acted single-mindedly and without hesitation upon the sudden arousal of his zeal for God. He did not pause to consider the socio-political ramifications of his actions, nor did he stop to open a consecratory dialogue. He didn't want dialogue. Rather, Phinehas, inflamed with divine jealousy on behalf of his God, immediately and decisively responded to the vile abomination which had been abruptly confronted. Like Phinehas, Mattisyahu identified sin and reacted with righteous violence against it. Like Phinehas, Mattisyahu struck down the life of an unfaithful Israeli, as well as the Gentile with whom he was aligned. For Phinehas, his actions would be the culmination of a bloodbath set against his fallen brothers. For Mattisyahu, it would signal the end of the hemorrhage of lives lost to assimilation and defeat. Let everyone who is zealous for the Torah and who stands by the covenant follow after me. That's what Mattisyahu said. The rallying cry of the devoted priest rang after him as he sped through the streets of Modin. Many who could no longer bear the crushing weight of unrighteous oppression gathered with their families and followed Mattisyahu out into the desert. So he was gathering people to follow him and not put up with this anymore. His sudden act of extreme zeal had incited the surge of strength among the people, yet the tyrannical arm of anti-Semitism would arrogantly extend even to the expanse of the wilderness. In other words, they were going to follow him. Still more misfortunes would befall the faithful ones in Israel. As in 1 Maccabees 2:31-38, it says, "It was reported to the officers and soldiers of the king who were in the city of David, in Jerusalem, that certain men who had flouted the king's order had gone out into a hiding place in the desert." So the ones who are rebelling against the king are going out to hide into the desert, and someone tells the king that they're doing so. Many hurried out after them, and having caught up with them, camped opposite and prepared to attack them. Prepared to attack them on the Sabbath. You know why they prepared to attack them on the Sabbath? Because they thought they wouldn't fight back. "Enough of this," the pursuers said to them. "Come out and obey the king's command, and your lives will be spared." But they replied, "We will not come out, nor will we obey the king's command to profane the Sabbath." But the enemy attacked them at once, but they did not retaliate. They neither drew stones nor blocked up their own hiding places. So at first they weren't going to attack them because it was the Sabbath. They said, "Let us all die without reproach. Heaven and earth are witnesses that you destroyed us unjustly." So the officers and soldiers attacked them on the Sabbath, and they died with their wives and their children and their cattle, to the number of 1,000 persons. 1,000 people died because they weren't willing to fight because it was the Sabbath. They thought they were profaning the Sabbath. And that's why they were trying to attack them on the Sabbath, because they knew they wouldn't fight back. So a group of broken, homeless families trying only to sustain a flicker of faithfulness were mercilessly hunted and slain in exchange for their dedication to the Lord. Sold out to God, they were marginalized Jews that even in the face of certain death, they chose not to violate the Torah and lift a hand to defend themselves. On that sanctified day of rest, no less than 1,000 people succumbed to extermination, preferring to die rather than profane the holy Sabbath, the holy Shabbat. Though grieved by the unjust murder of their kinsmen, reality presented Matisyahu and the others with a little bit of a dilemma. Nevertheless, they reached a consensus. So this is what happens. They see this thousand people get killed on the Sabbath. And this is what Matisyahu says. When Matisyahu and his friends heard of it, they mourned deeply for them. But he says, if we all do as our kinsmen have done, and do not fight against the Gentiles for our lives and our traditions, they will soon destroy us from the earth. On that day, they came to this decision. Let us fight anyone who attacks us on the Sabbath, so that we may not die as our kinsmen died in the hiding places. So finally they said, it doesn't matter if this is Sabbath or not. We're going to have to do this to preserve our lives because they're going to kill everybody. The painful verdict was in. Fight to keep Israel alive, even if it means engaging the enemy on the Shabbat. Clearly, Matisyahu and his friends held the belief that the Lord did not want the Jewish people and way of life to be completely destroyed from the earth, so they resolved to defend themselves on the Sabbath, not in disregard for the holy day, but so that future generations could honor it. And the whole Torah, freely, once again. Yes, they would fight for the Lord and the preservation of their way of life. And the decision was made, and the rebellion had begun. In 1 Maccabees 2:42 through 47, it says, then they were all joined by a group of Hasdinians, valiant Israelites, all of them devout followers of the Torah. And all those who were fleeing from the disaster joined them and supported them. They gathered an army and struck down the sinners in their anger and Torah breakers in their wrath. So anyone who was breaking the Torah, they started killing them. And the survivors fled to the Gentiles for safety. Now, they were killing other Jews because many other Jews and Israelites were profaning the Sabbath. I'm sorry, profaning the Torah. Altogether, they were profaning the Torah. Matisyahu and his friends went about and tore down the pagan altars. They also enforced circumcision for any uncircumcised boys whom they found in the territory of Israel. They put to flight the arrogant, and the work prospered in their hands. Matisyahu and his devout band of zealots fought the fight of righteousness, not merely against their oppressors, but especially against the Jewish secularists, the sinners, the Torah breakers. Those who survived the purging attacks but refused to repent of their apostasy fled to the Gentiles. So now Matisyahu and this group are attacking all of the Jews around them who are breaking Torah, who have decided to side with the Greeks, and they were now escaping to the Gentiles for help. It would not be until after Matisyahu's death that the fruit of his dedication will be fully grown. Yehuda Maccabee, the warrior's son, Matisyahu's son Yehuda, would promptly pick up his father's torch and lead the way to the victorious rededication of the temple. Matisyahu's spark of righteousness set a restoration movement on fire. His zeal was marked by an absolute refusal to conform and a consummate fervor for the Torah, the covenant, and the God of his fathers. This father and priest dedicated his life and the lives of his sons to the sole cause of reviving Israel. Engraved on the pages of history forever, this is one man's legacy to all generations. Summed up simply in verse 48, it says, they saved the Torah from the hands of the Gentiles and of the kings, and did not let the sinner triumph. Okay, I'm going to keep going and for another 30 minutes. If I don't get to finish, we might have to do a part 2 tomorrow. Maybe we'll do a part 2 tomorrow and the giving away of the book if I don't finish. So Matisyahu and his friends and his sons warred with an unending commitment against the evil powers of assimilation and anti-Semitism. Needfully, now by the way, just so you know, anti-Semitism is not just I mean, anti-Semitism today is not just against Jews. Anti-Semitism will absolutely include any Christian or believer. Okay, I want to make that clear because people think, well, anti-Semitism, that's Jews. I don't have anything to worry about because I'm not Jewish and I believe in the Messiah. I'm a Christian. No. What does the Bible say? What does the book of Revelation say? The book of Revelation says anyone who has Yeshua as their Messiah, in other words, who has the what does it say? Who holds on to the gospel of the Messiah and follows his commandments and follows the commandments, is whom the dragon comes after. He's coming after Israel and her seed. Needfully spilling the blood of the wicked, they courageously defended their way of life, fighting back the forces that would see it destroyed. Yet as the atrocities against Israel continue to rage, some would resist not by taking life, but by fearlessly giving up their own. People were willing to risk their life because their lives were being taken anyway. This story's crazy. In the following tragic tale, we find the gripping story of a mother and her sons consuming dedication to the Lord and his Torah, to the death. In the 7th chapter of 2nd Maccabees, the family's cause for imprisonment as the stage is set for their agonizing yet inspiring tragedy. It says this, it also happened that 7 brothers with their mother, 7 brothers and their mother, were arrested and tortured with whips and scourges by the king to enforce them to eat pork in violation of the Torah. You have to understand, guys, when you tell a Jew that Jesus came to make it okay to eat pork, you're basically telling them that Jesus came to break all of God's commandments, This is where Christianity has really done a disservice to the Jewish people who could have possibly come to know Yeshua as the Messiah, because they teach that the new covenant did away with the laws. We can eat pork. It doesn't say that. Those are misinterpretations of the New Testament, which I won't get into right now, but you have to understand that was what was happening at the time. The Greeks were forcing them to eat pork. The refusal to consume meat that the Lord had declared unclean for Israel became a rallying symbol of defiance against the assimilation and anti-Semitism. Surely the words of the Torah in Leviticus 11:44 resounded in their hearts. This is Leviticus. For I am the Lord your God. Therefore sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. And do not defile your souls, but make a separation between clean and unclean, clean animals and unclean animals. God commanded this to Israel. You are to make a distinction between clean and unclean. There are clean animals that you're supposed to eat. There are unclean animals that you're not supposed to eat. Blatantly defying the king's decree, the family's fate would soon be sealed. Their resistance committing them to abuse, martyrdom, suffering, and sacrifice for their shared convictions. The eldest son would be first among the brothers to speak out and receive his reward. Verses 2-4 reveal the cruelty that awaited him and the price of his pious dissidence. So this is what it says in 2nd Maccabees. It says, one of the brothers, speaking for the others, said, "What do you expect to achieve by questioning us? We are ready to die rather than transgress the Torah of our ancestors." At that the king, in a fury, gave orders to his pans and cauldrons. So he had these pans heated up. While they were being quickly heated, he commanded his executioners to cut out the tongue of the one who had spoken for the others, and to scalp him, and cut off his hands and feet, while the rest of his brothers and his mother looked on. This is what they were facing. Being heated up in a pan, tongue cut out, hands and feet cut off, and basically burned alive. The first brother openly proclaimed their collective resolution. They would die before transgressing the Torah. Receiving this declaration with the defiance that was intended, the king wasted no time in fearlessly punishing the brother for his insidious talk. It goes on to say that when he was completely maimed, this first brother, but still breathing, the king ordered them to carry him to the fire and fry him. As a cloud of smoke spread from the pan, the brothers and their mother encouraged one another to die bravely, saying words such as these: "The Lord our God is looking on, and he truly has compassion on us." As Moses declared in his song, when he protested openly with the words, "And he will have pity on his servants." This is what they're saying as they're dying, guys. It's really it's very gruesome, this part. It's very gruesome. Now seized by the reality of their predicament, the mother and her sons ardently encouraged one another with the words of hope and remembrance of God's promises. So the enemy continued on anyway, to a very gruesome end. When the first brother had died in this manner, they brought the second to be made sport of. After tearing off the skin and hair of his head, they asked him, "Will you eat the pork rather than have your body tortured limb by limb?" Do you understand how crazy this is? They were forcing them to eat pork, or else they were going to rip their limbs off and kill them. Answering in the language of his forefathers, he said, "Never." So he too, in turn, suffered the same tortures as the first. At the point of his death, he said, "You accursed fiend, you are depriving us of this present life. But the King of the world will raise us up to live again forever." Jews back then even believed in a resurrection. Okay? They believed in a resurrection. It is for his Torah that we are dying. With his last breath, the second brother clung to his convictions, declaring his undying faithfulness to God and hope for everlasting life. In a remarkable demonstration of sheer audacity, the third and fourth brothers displayed unmatched violence as they met their demise. This is what happens to the third brother. After him, the third suffered their cruel sport. He put out his tongue at once. Basically, they're torturing him, and they're about to cut out his tongue, and he just willfully sticks his tongue out when told to do so, and bravely held out his hands. "Go ahead, take it." As he spoke these noble words, "It was from heaven that I received these. For the sake of his Torah, I disdain them." So in other words, I was given hands and feet and a tongue by God when I was born, but for his Torah's sake, I'm willing to lose them. From him, I hope to receive them again one day. Even the king and his attendants marveled at the young man's courage, because he regarded his suffering as nothing. You know, it had to be really irritating these men who were torturing them to see that they had no regard for the fact that they were torturing them. He disdained his own form, regarding his suffering as nothing, and in doing so managed to reach the minds of his oppressors, if even for a moment. So here's what happens to the fourth brother. After he died, they tortured and maltreated the fourth brother in the same way. When he was near death, he said, "It is my choice to die at the hands of men, with the God-given hope of being restored to life by him. But for you, there will be no resurrection of life." They really believed this. They always believed that God would resurrect them at some point. Brothers 5 and 6 walked faithfully in the footsteps of their elders, proclaiming condemnation for the king. The fifth one spoke these words. They next brought forward the fifth brother and maltreated him. Looking at the king, he said, "Since you have power among men, mortal though they are, do what you please. But do not think that our nation is forsaken by God." He said, don't think our nation is forsaken by God. Only wait, and you will see how his great power will torment you and your descendants. And then it goes on to say, after him, they brought the sixth brother. When he was about to die, he said, "Have no vain illusions. We suffer these things on our own account because we have sinned against our God." So they understood why they were suffering. "That is why such astonishing things have happened to us. But do not think then that you will go unpunished for having dared to fight against God." Most admirable and worthy of everlasting remembrance was the mother who saw her 7 sons perish in a single day, yet bore it courageously because of her hope in the Lord. Filled with a noble spirit that stirred her womanly heart with manly courage, she exhorted each of them in the language of their forefathers with these words. "I do not know how you came into existence in my womb." This is what she's saying to her kids who are being tortured. "I do not know how you came into existence in my womb. It was not I who gave you the breath of life, nor was it I who set in order the elements of which each of you is composed." In other words, I didn't create you. You were just growing in my body. "Therefore, since it is the creator of the universe who shapes each man's beginning as he brings about the origin of everything, he in his mercy will give you back both breath and life because you now disregard yourselves for the sake of the Torah. Because you are giving up your lives, God is going to have mercy upon you and give you back. He's going to give you back the life and the breath that you gave up for his sake." Remember, this kingdom to come, this is not a Christian concept. This is a Jewish concept. They believed in the kingdom to come when things would be restored. "For one who bore life so many times, should we not be humbled by her readiness to promote its loss? Most mothers would sooner die than permit harm to befall their children, yet this one exhorts hers in their complete disregard for self. She was moved by faith that says there is purpose in dedication to God, that even life is not too precious to give up for the one who gives life forever." Feeling belittled by her words and inadequate at forcing a conversion, the king hoped to change the tactics. A change in tactics would yield more favorable results. So now the king's thinking, I'm going to change it up a little bit. In the last-ditch effort with the 7th and final son, the king made a tempting and lucrative offer to acquire the boy's soul. This is the last son, so he's like, let's see if I can win this one over. Antiochus, suspecting insult in her words, thought he was being ridiculed. As the youngest brother was still alive, the king appealed to him, not with mere words, but with promises on oath, to make him rich and happy if he would abandon his ancestral customs. See, that's the promise of abandoning your faith and your customs with God. Being rich and happy. He would make him his friend and entrust him with a high office. Oh, we'll give you a position too. We'll give you a job. When the youth paid no attention to him at all, the king appealed to the mother, urging her to advise her boy to save his life. After he had urged her for a long time, she went through the motions of persuading her son. So this is what happens, guys. But she was encouraging her son not to give in to the temptations of what he was offering. She was encouraging her son to continue on as her brothers had. In the derision of the cruel tyrant, she leaned over close to her son and said in their native language, "Son, have pity on me, who carried you in my womb for 9 months, nursed you for 3 years, brought you up, educated, and supported you in your present age. I beg you, child, to look at the heavens and the earth and see all that is in them. Then you will know that God did not make them out of existing things. And it is the same way the human race came into existence. Do not be afraid of this executioner, but be worthy of your brothers and accept death, so that in the time of mercy I may receive you again with them." She had scarcely finished speaking when the youth, the last son, says, "What are you waiting for? I will not obey the king's command. I will obey the command of the Torah, given to our forefathers through Moses. But you, who have contrived every kind of affliction for the Hebrews, will not escape the hands of God." With unshakable conviction and unlimited devotion to his family, his people, and his God, the seventh son would choose a blood-curdling death rather than relinquish his obligation to Israel's son. He would exhaust his final breath to articulate both his disdain for the king and his regret over the actions of his people, actions which caused the Lord's wrath to fall mercilessly upon the people. See, we are giving in here in America. We're giving in. We've been giving in little by little every single year for a long time now. And now it's coming to a point where it's almost too late. And we're very close to God lifting his hand off of this nation, his hand of protection off of this nation. Yet the weight of the moment would not dampen his expectation for divine forgiveness and reconciliation for his people. Full of faith, the seventh son prayed that his death, along with the deaths of his brothers, would help bring atonement for Israel. He fervently anticipated a coming display of God's awesome power, through which even the king himself would soon confess the one true and living God. The account of this selfless family's calamitous yet victorious end concludes with 2 Maccabees 7:32 through 41. And it says this: "The seventh son continued, and he says, 'We indeed are suffering because of our sins. Though the Lord, the living, treats us harshly for a little while to correct us with chastisements, he will again be reconciled with his servants. But you, wretch, vilest of all men, do not in your insolence concern yourself with unfolded hopes, as you raise your hand against the children of heaven. You have not yet escaped the judgment of the Almighty and all-seeing God. My brothers, after enduring brief pain, have drunk of never-failing life under God's covenant, but you, by the judgment of God, shall receive just punishments for your arrogance. Like my brothers, I offer up my body and my life to our ancestral Torah, imploring God to show mercy soon to our nation, and by afflictions and blows to make you confess that he alone is God." This child is saying, I know we have to suffer because of our sins, but God, I hope that God shows you, after all of this, that he alone is God. Through me and my brothers, may there be an end to the wrath of the Almighty that has justly fallen on our whole nation. And at that the king became enraged and treated him even worse than the others, since he bitterly resisted the boy's contempt. Thus he too died undefiled, putting all his trust in the Lord. The mother was the last to die after her sons. Oh, that we as a people and disciples of Messiah would be so willing to lay down our lives for what we believe. Are we willing to face arrest and torture, whipping and scourging, scalping and maiming? We're not even prepared to accept a harsh word from somebody on social media because of what we believe. How are we going to stand up for what we believe in the face of death? Are we prepared to have our tongues cut out, our hands and feet lopped off, our skin and hair ripped off from our bodies? Could we bear being seared in a boiling cauldron, our life billowing out of us in a cloud of smoke, fried away as steam from our mangled bodies? It's that gruesome, guys, and guess what? It's going to be that gruesome one day again. Maybe not to you, but listen, in fact, it's already happening around the world. Would we still praise our Maker while being forced to watch our loved ones tormented and made sport of? Or every single one of our children butchered before our eyes? Or can we as disciples of Messiah barely endure a harsh word or a nasty look for the sake of our convictions? We in the body of Messiah, we can barely endure a harsh word or a nasty look for the sake of our convictions. The martyred mother and her 7 sons were ready to die rather than transgress the Torah. They had the courage to contend for their faith with their lives, regarding their sufferings as nothing. They regarded their suffering as nothing, just as Paul regarded his suffering as nothing, just like the Messiah regarded his suffering as nothing. They offered up their bodies for the sake of the Lord's law, his Torah, disregarding themselves and accepting death. They faced unspeakable persecution and their inevitable demise with faith that the Lord was looking on, trust that he had compassion on them, in hope of being restored to life, and they died undefiled. The question is, would we? Would you or I, in the same predicament, or even, let's just say, facing jail because of what we believe, would we be able to stand for what we believe? 2 Maccabees 7:42 says, enough had been said about the sacrificial meals and the excessive cruelties. Let's see here. Yeah, we're almost done, guys. We have 2 more chapters. Okay, we're almost done. Many faithful ones, both heroes and martyrs, would give their lives selflessly for the cause of Israel's restoration. After Judah, son of Mattisyahu, assumed his father's command, the resistance matured into a full-blown revolution. This is the time when now it's become a full-blown revolution under Yehuda. Securing significant military victories despite being vastly outnumbered. This is actually the miracle, guys. They were majorly outnumbered, and they were winning military victories. With the attacking armies humiliated and Antiochus broken and defeated, Judah and the sons of Israel miraculously triumphed over their long-term oppressors. 2 Maccabees 10:1-5 tells of the recapturing and rededication of the temple of the Lord. When Yehuda ha-Maccabee and his companions, under the Lord's leadership, had recovered the temple and the city, they destroyed the altars erected by the Gentiles in the marketplace and the sacred enclosures. After purifying the temple, they made a new altar. Then with fire struck from the flint, they offered sacrifices for the first time in 2 years, burnt incense and lighted the lamps of the menorah. They also set out the showbread, and when they had done this, they prostrated themselves and begged the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, and that if they should sin at any time, he might chastise them with moderation and not hand them over to blasphemous and barbarous Gentiles. Now, when I say Gentiles, guys, that just means the nations. The nations at those times were heathen, pagan, polytheistic people, groups, and cultures. On the anniversary of the day on which the temple had been profaned by the Gentiles, that is the 25th. So the 25th day of the 12th of the 9th month ended up coming into being because that was the date. That was the date that the Greeks chose to defile the temple. the purification of the temple took place. With the temple finally back in the Jewish hands 2 years to the day since being profaned by the Gentiles, Yehuda oversaw the destruction of the defamements and the reinstitution of the temple services. So they're reinstituting everything, guys. They're tearing down all of the idols and all of the pagan altars. Those present worshipped God, thankful for the victory over their persecutors. They petitioned the Lord concerning any future chastisement for Israel, that his punishment, unlike that of recent events, might be down with moderation. Finally, verses 6 through 8 recount the commencement of the brand new Feast of Dedication, drawing to a close the historical, essential, and real story of Hanukkah. And this is what it says. The Jews celebrated joyfully for 8 days as the Feast of Booths, remembering how 8 days, just like on the Feast of Booths, so the Feast of Booths is also celebrated for 8 days, remembering how a little while before they had spent the Feast of Booths living like wild animals in caves in the mountains. Remember, they had to go into hiding. So they had to celebrate Feast of Booths in hiding. And the Feast of Booths is celebrated for 8 days. That might probably be the more reliable reason for why it's celebrated for 8 days and not that the oil lasted for 8 days. Who knows? Carrying rods entwined with leaves, green branches, and palms, they sang hymns of grateful praise to him who had brought about the purification of his own place. By public edict and decree, they prescribed that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate these days every year. Yehuda and his men celebrated their astounding victory, and Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, was born. But if those days commemorated any miracle, it was that even after Israel's apostasy from top to bottom, both willingly and forced, the Lord honored the faithful few who fought to restore the nation. That's the real miracle, guys, that God honored the ones who were willing to fight. Yet palm branches and praise had come at a price, a cost far too steep to ignore. Let us hear again how, sober with the reality of their triumph, these valiant ones first prostrated themselves and begged the Lord. In other words, they continued begging him not to chastise them so harshly. May the plea of the Hanukkah freedom fighters not be lost to us. We who have the hindsight, because you and I, we have the hindsight of 3,500 years of history, biblical history. For despite their petition concerning future chastisement, Israel would continue to suffer heinous atrocities over the ensuing 2 millennia. Can we ignore the destruction of Jerusalem and the forced expulsion of the 1st and 2nd centuries? Can we discount the painful record of the Crusades or the Inquisition? Can we forget the viciousness of the pogroms or the unfathomable monstrosities of the Holocaust? What shall we say of these? Has the Lord been chastising his people? If so, has it been with moderation? Indeed, 6 million Jews. How should we regard such abominable horrors? And should we assume that those days are done forever? As one who cries out for the restoration and salvation of his people, the Jewish people, I am compelled to ponder the gravity of these questions. If there is even the slightest possibility that we have endured chastisements for our historical habit of willfully wandering, deliberate assimilation, and flagrant rejection of the Lord and his Torah, should we not at least stop to consider our abstinence? In other words, if we have constantly been chastised in this manner for going away from God and his Torah, should we not stop to consider us abstaining from it? If neither the heroic acts of our ancestors nor the persecution of our fathers will inspire us to come back to God, what is it going to take? A new Antiochus Epiphanes? A second Hitler? Another 6 million lives or more? We say never again, but are we, because after the Holocaust, we say never again, like we'll never let this happen again. But are we truly doing all we can to prevent future mistreatment? Whether or not we bear any responsibility for our own persecution, the facts of our history remain. In the generations that lived after the world's Antiochus and Hitler's wielded power, we still failed to learn and failed to return. So it's very sad. Today, the Jewish people as a whole remain far away from the Lord. This is a fact. For the most part, for the majority. Some of us insulated by our zeal for man-made religions, most of us just entwined with the ways of the world. We love this wonderful westernized society of individualism, celebration of the body, and alternative lifestyles. A world where we glibly satisfy our flesh and conceal our identity and carelessly betray our calling in our God. A world in which Jews celebrate Christmas, or the Jewish version we naively called Hanukkah. If we can learn anything from the real story of Hanukkah, it is that the foray into the world of the flesh begins with what can seem like innocent steps. It can seem like innocent steps, dabbling with the tree of knowledge of good and evil. While the Christmas-like way we observe Hanukkah is hardly the first or even the most significant of such incursions, it is nevertheless symbolic and revealing of a people bent on disappearing into the nations. Listen, this is speaking to Christians as well. Surely there is nothing sinister about celebrating Judaism's festival of lights. The Hanukkah, or the menorah, the nine-branch menorah, in all its glory is an icon of Judaic beauty. Unquestionably, we are welcome to conduct our festivities, exchange our gifts, spin our dreidels, eat our latkes, even recite the traditional blessings that place the world of the rabbis on the lips of the Creator. As part of our heritage and culture as Jews, we are free to participate in this generation's version of the feast to whatever degree we deem useful and fit and lovely. But there is a cost. But is there a cost that we have failed to count? As Jews, we need to consider whether there is really, as Jews or Christians, we need to consider any level on which we can truly embrace the spirit of year-end Western world winter holidays. While the setting of Hanukkah is surely our own, the spirit and the priority and even traditions are borrowed, unordained, fabricated, and foreign. Same thing goes with Christmas, guys. The settings of Christmas, we can just replace that word. The settings of Christmas are surely not our own. The spirit, priority, and traditions are borrowed, unordained, fabricated, and foreign. In the greatest of ironies, we have permitted the spirit of assimilation to abduct the real Hanukkah story from our individual and communal Jewish consciousness. The Feast of Dedication is not about gifts, games, fun, or food. It's not about the Jewish counterpart to a Christian event designed to make us feel less like strangers among the nations who host us. For believers in Yeshua, Hanukkah is not about Jewish evangelism or making messianic application out of a manufactured Jewish ceremony, nor is it about forsaking a pagan Christian holiday and swapping it out for a Hebraic holiday. In other words, don't swap out Christmas for Hanukkah just to celebrate Hanukkah in the same way that we celebrate that people have celebrated Christmas in this worldly spirit. If and when we celebrate Hanukkah, it should be in the memory of those who would surely cringe in anguish at how we have reduced marginalized, and forgotten their accomplishments, sacrifices, and convictions. It should be in honor of Matisyahu, Yehuda and his brothers, the mother and her 7 sons, and all those nameless, faceless ones who fought and died beside them. What would these resolute men and women say about the way their descendants have lived today? Dispersed among the nations, indifferent towards Israel's restoration, content to integrate with and vanish into the surrounding society. Quick to forsake and forget our unique identity. Remember, if you're grafted into Israel, this is your story as well. Forget your unique identity and the purposes for which the Lord has eternally set us apart. If and when we celebrate Hanukkah, as long as we fail to remember the commitment of our forefathers, we will surely fail to pass on to the next generation the true meaning of dedication. The word Hanukkah comes from the Hebrew word Hanuk, which means to dedicate. It appears only a few times in Scripture, one of which is often quoted in the often quoted proverb, "Train up a child in the way he should go." And the word train up, which translates a form of Hanuk, would be rendered, dedicate a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is what the Feast of Hanukkah is really about. Not mythical miracles or military maneuvers, but the absolute, unconditional imperative to be so completely and continually devoted to God that we will never again consider departing from his ways. Not us, and more importantly, not our children, who rely on our dedication so that they will know the way that they should go. Such generational dedication is encapsulated for us in the words of zealous Matisyahu, who even on his deathbed continued to exhort his sons to remain faithful to the Torah. That is, to the Lord. 1 Maccabees 2, 49 through 51, 61 and 64 record his stirring and inspiring words, which we would all do well to heed and take to heart. So I'm going to read this again. These are times of violence and distress. This is Matisyahu speaking. We're almost done, guys. These are times of violence and distress. Arrogant people are in control and have made us an object of ridicule. Remember, this is happening to us today in America. But you, my sons, must be devoted to the Torah and ready to die to defend God's covenant with our ancestors. Remember what our ancestors did and how much they accomplished in their day. Follow their example, and you will realize that no one who puts his trust in the Lord will ever lack strength. My sons, be strong and courageous in defending the Torah. And remember, the laws of America are based on the laws of the Torah. Just remember that. And all of our laws are being taken away. From generation to generation, as echoed in this father's parting instructions, only those devoted and dedicated to the Lord will triumph and overcome. Our ancestors serve as an example to us, urging us towards an unfailing righteousness and zeal. They remind us, with their abiding character and commitment, how to live courageously and uncompromisingly to God. So, when will we bear their standard? One more page, guys. The sons of Israel continue to suffer from a 3,500-year-old identity crisis. Unable to keep our eyes and hands to ourselves, we stand as an example to the world, not of righteousness, but of rebellion. The real story of the Festival of Lights illuminates the essence of our ancestral struggle and points to our only hope for reprieve. While we have been selling our souls, hoping to be absorbed into the nations around us, we should have been lighting their way back to God with selfless dedication of our lives. It is exactly as the Apostle Paul acknowledges in Acts 13:47 as the birthright of every son and daughter of Israel and the collective responsibility we have to the nations. And Paul says, "For this is how the Lord commanded us. I have set for you to be a light to the nations, for you to be for salvation to the ends of the earth. As the Master Yeshua teaches us, we are the light of the world, and we are made to shine his light with brilliance and power, so that all who are in the house may see. Instead, we have been hiding our lamp under a basket, a bed, or a jar. I'm almost done. Anywhere but on the mountaintop where the Lord has set us, fashioned to radiate the glory of his awesome and holy name. The real story of Hanukkah, the story of few devoted, dedicated, yet ordinary followers of God, should inspire us then to press on towards the goal. These stalwart ones relentlessly trusted the Lord, looked to the testimony and instruction of his word, and with faith and conviction of cause applied it to their lives, acted on its teachings. And as disciples of Messiah, can we do any less than fully commit ourselves to the cause of our Master and see it through with irrepressible and ferocious dedication? Let us devote ourselves to walking in the footsteps of the Messiah, who was himself a self-sacrificial radical for God. The same one who zealously ravaged the temple marketplace was also the ready shepherd, willing to lay down his life for those in his care. When the time came for him to consummate the pledge, he became obedient to death, death even at an execution stake. To such selfless sacrifice, how can we respond with anything but our lives? Indeed, for those of us who say we love Yeshua, who have committed in our hearts to serve him, we confess inwardly to be dedicated to no longer living for ourselves, but for him who died for us. Are we willing to go with him to the very end? If we have chosen to follow the Master Yeshua, have we not also chosen death? Does not the Messiah say to those who endure to the end that they will deliver you up to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all the nations because of my name? Won't those who persevere one day be delivered up also by your parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death? Is this what you agreed to accept when you accepted Messiah's life in exchange for your own? Is this the life you are prepared to lay down for the one who first gave his for yours? If you are truly dedicated to following the Master Yeshua, we must be willing to follow him wherever he goes. The Master says that to bear fruit, first a seed must die. But that seed must not merely fall to the ground, it must be willing to be destroyed. Indeed, to hate its life. Just as the Messiah was willing to lose his life for us, he beckons his servants to follow him, to abandon ourselves completely, to be dedicated unto death. And as if the Master's example was not enough, listen to Paul's radical, he quotes some things from Paul. And so he talks about being obedient unto death if you're following the Messiah. The heroes of the real Hanukkah story fought, endured suffering, and freely gave their lives for the cause in which they were so passionately believed. They were also committed to the revolution because they had no other choice. They were unwilling to abandon their identity, surrender their birthright, or assist in the defilement of their God. As disciples of Messiah, how much more should we dedicate ourselves to wholehearted service of the Master? How much more should we be selfless and sacrificial? We are the light of the world, dedicated and set apart as a piercing lamp, made to cast the light as of a pure and holy flame. Our forefathers sacrificed wealth, prestige, comfort, safety, dignity, homes, children, and yes, even themselves. As disciples of Messiah, how much more should we be committed to his eternal cause, refusing to assimilate into the world, denying compromise at foothold in our lives, faithfully putting the Lord's word into action, and utterly and absolutely giving our whole selves to what we believe, whether by our life or by our death. When we dedicate our lives completely to the cause of the Messiah, we have nothing to lose but ourselves. Either way we choose, we are going to lose. The question is, Whose life does it cost less to live? Ours or his? Romans 4, I'm going to end with Romans 14:8 saying, if we live, to the master we live. If we also die, to the master we die. Then whether we live or if we die, we are the master Yeshua's. All right, guys, we have finally come to an end. 2 hours and 15 minutes later. I'm so sorry it was so long, but Hanukkah only comes once a year. Anybody who's watching that's interested in this book here that we just read from today, let me know in the comments if you're interested. I only have one. I'm going to do a drawing tomorrow, and we'll find out who the winner is. I pray that you will take into consideration the true meaning of Hanukkah, and that you will incorporate it into your lives from this moment forward in each passing year. And I hope you will keep this story in mind when you look at what's happening here in America, when you look at what's happening in in all of the countries all over the world, and how it's all playing out again. Shabbat Shalom. I pray to see you tomorrow for the book drawing, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Shabbat Shalom, and Happy Hanukkah.